Greetings and welcome again to Word Magazine. This is Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. And in this episode of Word Magazine, we're going to be looking at the question of how much extant second century Greek manuscript evidence is there available for reconstructing the text of the New Testament. Modern textual criticism is devoted to reconstruction of the text, studying the empirical extant evidence. And I've noted, especially in the last podcast I did, that is a departure from the pre-modern Protestant approach to Scripture, which stressed the preservation of Scripture. Now the emphasis is on we can take the empirical evidence and we can reconstruct the text. Or so that was the emphasis of textual criticism in the so-called modern period, late 19th and through the 20th century. But with the 21st century, there has been a shift. And now in mainstream academic scholarship of the Greek New Testament, the scholars are saying it's really not possible for us to reconstruct the authorial text. There's not enough extant evidence. There's not enough very early extant evidence. There's not enough information from the second century in order to definitively reconstruct the text. And that's why they no longer talk about reconstructing the autograph. They don't see that as an appropriate goal for New Testament textual criticism. Instead, they say we have to settle for the initial text or the Ausgangs text. We can work toward getting an approximation of what the text might be. And this is a challenge, I think, for many evangelical scholars who have warmly embraced modern textual criticism, because mainstream academic criticism is telling us now that we really can't ever know what the text of the Bible is. And there is kind of some rear guard apologetic defense for evangelicals as to why they can recognize the realities of this and still say it's okay to use modern textual criticism to approximate what the New Testament text might have been or might be. In order to enter into this discussion, I'm once again going to turn to a blog article written by Dr. Michael J. Kruger. And we were discussing him in the last podcast when we were looking at the question of the goal of modern textual criticism. And we're going to look at another popular blog article that he wrote, this time not on the Gospel Coalition, a website. This comes from his personal blog, which is called Cannon Fodder. And this is an article that was posted on September the 30th of 2025. And it's titled, How Many New Testament Manuscripts Do We Have from the Second Century? And again, this is sort of responding to the modern skepticism in the academy about the lack of substantial second century evidence, which undermines any concept of being able to reconstruct the New Testament text. And in this article, he's going to, again, sort of do a rearguard action where he's saying, well, he's going to point to 12 manuscripts from the second century. But again, we already saw last time in his discussion of the goal of textual criticism that the best we can say is that we're working toward some approximation of what the New Testament is. But let's look at what he has to say about this evidence from the second century. Now, for a long time, particularly modern evangelical scholars who have embraced modern textual criticism, they're fond of saying, we have an abundance of riches as New Testament scholars. If you compare the texts of works from classical antiquity, we have so many more manuscripts. We have over 5,000 manuscripts. But often what isn't said is that most of those 5,000 manuscripts are very late. They're after the year 900 or even 1,000. And many of the earliest ones are only fragmentary. They're not, it's not like we have multiple scores of papyri manuscripts that have the entirety of the New Testament or even whole books. And that'll become more evident as we look through this article as to what we really have from the second century. So I'm just going to read through the article, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time looking more closely at these 12 witnesses that are dated by some to the second century. That even that's contested what the date of these should be, and we're going to look at the fragmentary nature of them. So let's just start off here. It starts with a quote from Harvard New Testament scholar Helmut Kester, and he says there is no second century manuscript evidence. And I'm assuming he was probably writing in the mid to late 20th century. And then the article starts with Kruger saying, when it comes to the transmission of the New Testament text, the second century has long been recognized as a critical time period. And it is not hard to see why. If the New Testament books were written more or less in the first century, then the extant manuscripts that get us closest to that time period will inevitably take on a level of significance. Let me just pause here. If you're assuming that we have to reconstruct the text, obviously, if the last New Testament book was written in the first century, which we believe is the case, then there were manuscripts from the second century that were very close to the time of the authorial writing, then that would be provide very valuable evidence. The problem is Helmut Kester says there's no second century evidence. So we're reliant on materials that are 2, 3, 4, 500 years after the writing of the apostles. He continues here. The second century is also significant because of modern scholarly claims that it was precisely this period when the most serious textual corruptions were likely to have occurred, suggesting the earliest phases of transmission were marked by, in quotes, textual chaos. So this is another theory, theoretical proposition of modern textual criticism, that the second century documents in the 100s, that's when they were less uniform, there's more variation, and even there was textual anarchy or textual chaos during that period. So, do we have any manuscripts that possibly go back to this important century? Some scholars say no, Helmut Kester being one of them. Although I think his statement might have been hyperbolic. Surely there were some papyri that were discovered during his lifetime. Not sure when he wrote that, where the quote is from. As the above quote by Helmut Kester indicates, many see the second century as unreachable, or as J.K. Elliott has argued, quote, the second century is something of a dark age as far as the history of the New Testament text is concerned, end quote. Not too long ago, I read and wrote a review of Stanley Porter's little book, How We Got the New Testament Text Transmission Translation. He calls the second century a tunnel period. Like you're going from the time of the apostles to the time of the early church, and there's a tunnel period in the second century because there's so little extant evidence from that period. And Kruger continues, and much of this skepticism has to do with the dating of manuscripts. In recent years, there has been a push to reconsider the dates of our earliest New Testament papyri, pushing the dates of these manuscripts later and later. And I think by that he means that early on in the 20th century, when these papyri were being discovered and being cataloged, there was a tendency to date them very early. And as time has gone on, there's been some reappraisals, and some of these things they thought were second century, they're now saying, well, it's more likely third century or fourth century. I believe a scholar named Brent Nongbri has been influential in challenging some of the early dating for some of this material. And then on the other hand, I think there are probably some people standing by those early datings. And so there's questions about the definitive datings of many of these witnesses, whether they're actually from the second century. Kruger continues, of course, we cannot resolve these debates over dating here. And a number of scholars remain unconvinced that the traditional dates given to these manuscripts are so unreliable. But even with this recent push to redate manuscripts, there are still a number that could be reasonably dated to the second century. And once again, we talked about this before with Dr. Kruger in the other article. We see some of what I would call the tentativeness in the language. There have been people who've challenged the early dates for these papyri manuscripts, and he's saying that that there still are a number that could be reasonably dated to the second century. He doesn't say that they can definitively be dated to the second century. He just mentions this is within the realm of the possible. This is possibly what could happen. He continues, I might suggest that a reasonable way to proceed is to include manuscripts which have been given a possible second century date either by A, the original editors, or B, the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. And he also references there the New Testament manuscripts catalog or list that is kept by the Institute for New Testament Textual Research. And he says, when we consider both sources, meaning the original dating and the current datings as provided in the Nestle-Aland 28th edition and by the Institute in Münster, we end up with 12 manuscripts, possibly from the second century. Now, again, remember, the purpose of this article is to buttress our confidence in the whole Reconstruction enterprise by knowing that we actually do have some second century manuscripts contra what was said by Helmut Kester. But the buttressing here seems particularly weak. And he's going to list 12 papyri manuscripts that are possibly, not definitively, but possibly from the second century. If they're possibly from the second century, this also means they could possibly not be from the second century. They could be from the third or the fourth century. At any rate, here is the list. He starts off with P52, the famous P52, the famous Rylands fragment containing portions of John 18 is still regarding by many, I think regarded by many, as the earliest New Testament manuscript in our possession, though P Papyrus 104 could challenge that claim. And if you take Introduction to the New Testament, almost invariably, the teacher is going to talk about P52 because it's often purported to be the earliest extant piece of evidence or witness to the Greek New Testament. It's kept at a library in Manchester, England, the John Rylands Library. And the thing about P52, though, it's not all of John. In fact, it's just a couple of verses. It's John 18, verses 31 through 33 on one side, and on the obverse side, it has verses 37 and 38. So it has part of 5 verses. In fact, are we sure that it was even from a manuscript of the Gospel of John? Could it have been from a lectionary? Could it have been, I don't know if you had a lectionary in the second century, but could it have been from some other kind of religious document or letter or just someone's list of passages? a florilegium, a collection of passages that someone had. We really don't know if this was coming from a Gospel of John. Then he lists among these 12 three papyri together, P4, P64, and P67. He says these three fragments containing portions of Matthew and Luke likely come from the same codex, which may have held all four Gospels. The same as P52. Again, it seems theoretical. He assumes it might have been from a gospel collection. It could have been something else altogether. We don't know. Um, well, let's look at this. P4, and now I'm going to pull up and I'm going to use my Nestle Aland 28th edition, which is the most recent scholarly edition or handbook of the Greek New Testament. It'll soon be replaced by NA 29. But at the back, it has a listing of papyri and uncials and minuscules and their suggested dates and where they're located and the contents of them. So P4 is in Paris, and it has fragments from Luke. It has Luke 1, verses 58 and 59. It has Luke 1, verses 62 through chapter 2, verse 1. And it has chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. It has chapter 3, verses 8 through 4. It has chapter 2, 29 through 32, and verses 34 and 35. It has chapter 5, verses 3 through 8, and chapter 5, 30, verse 30 through chapter 6 and verse 16. So it is a fragmentary collection of some verses from the Gospel of Luke. And then he also mentions P64 and P67. I'm going to turn and look at those. P64 is in Oxford at Magdalen College. And then it includes fragments of Matthew 3, verse 9 and verse 15, Matthew 5, verses 20 through 22, and verses 25 to 28, Matthew 26, verses 7 through 8, Matthew 26:10, Matthew 26:14 and 15, verses 22 through 23, verses 31 through 33. So just fragments from the Gospel of Matthew. P67, it says C, Papyrus 64 there. And now I see that that's the total for 64 and 67, the verses I just read. And part of it, I guess P67 is in Barcelona. And P64 apparently is in Oxford, if I'm reading this correctly. And again, I'm just turning to this right now, and I haven't really looked at this ahead of time. My point is that the first two of these 12 papyri that are possibly from the 2nd century are only fragmentary in content. P75 is going to be a little more substantial. Kruger says, this is a codex containing portions of Luke and John, which the original editors dated from between 175 and 225. So late 2nd century, early 3rd century. And again, P75 is a little more substantial. Looking it up here in my NA28, it's found in the Vatican, and it is Luke 3, 18 through 22, Luke 3, 33 through chapter 4, verse 2, chapter 4, verse 34 through chapter 5, verse 10, chapter 5, 37, verses chapter 6, 4, chapter 6:10 through 7:32, 7:35 through 39, 7:41 to 43, 7:46 through chapter 9, verse 2, chapter 9, verse 4 to chapter 17, verse 15, chapter 17, verse 19 to chapter 18, verse 18, chapter 22, verse 4 to the end of the Gospel of Luke. And then it has part of John, John 1, 1 through 11, John 1, 45, John 1, 48 through 57, John 12, 3 through 13, John 10, John 12 and verse 10, John 14, verses 8 through 15 and verse 10. So that's it for P75. Has a little bit more of Luke, has a few fragments from John, but it's very fragmentary. Let's see, let's go forward. Hope this isn't getting tedious, but I just want to be clear of these 12, just how fragmentary these witnesses are, these remains are. P77 says fragments from a single leaf containing portions of Matthew, but some scholars have argued for a 3rd century date. So let me look here at my NA28, P77. It's in Oxford, and according to the NA28 listing of the papyri, it only includes Matthew 23, verses 30 through 39. So it only has 10 verses. Verses 30 through 39 are found in P77. He says a single leaf containing portions of Matthew, which is 10 verses. P90, fragments of a leaf containing portions of John, chapters 18 and 19, but an early 3rd century date remains an option. So P90, according to the Nestle-Aland listing of the papyri, is also in Oxford, and it includes John 18, verse 36 through chapter 19, verse 1, and also John 19, verses 2 through 7. P98, our earliest fragment of Revelation, written on a reused roll, either late 2nd or early 3rd century. How much of Revelation does it have? I'm looking at my Nestle-Aland guide here. This is actually in Cairo, and it includes Revelation 1, verses 13 through 20. So a very small sliver of the book of Revelation indeed. Let's go on and look at the next one of these 12. P103, a single leaf containing portions of Matthew dated to the late 2nd, early 3rd by the original editors. And I'm going to look at P103 here. It's also in Oxford, and indeed it has Matthew 13, verses 55 and 56, and Matthew 14, verses 3 through 5. P104, another leaf with portions of Matthew, possibly as early or even earlier than P52. And this was what he had mentioned back earlier. A lot of people say P52 is the earliest, usually dated to about 125. But now he's saying some people are suggesting that Papyrus 104 is earlier. Papyrus 104 is also in Oxford, and it includes Matthew 21, verses 34 through 37, and Matthew 21, verse 43 through verse 45. And there's a question mark, maybe a question of how much of verse 45 it contains or what exactly the text is. Haven't examined it, so I don't know why the question mark. Let's keep going. Now, we've made it to P104. The next one, P129, is not one that's listed in the NA28, and I didn't look it up in the virtual manuscript room. Let's look at the description: an unpublished fragment of 1 Corinthians, possibly 2nd century, maybe early 3rd. One of the fragments belonging to the Egypt Exploration Society and illegally sold. And I didn't look it up, and it'll surely be listed in the Nestle-Aland 29th edition when they list the papyri, because there were 127 papyri, I think, that were listed. Yes, 127 papyri in NA28, and there have been new discoveries since that was published in 2012, some 13 years ago. But again, this one is fragmentary. P137 will be another new one that no doubt will appear in Nestle Aland 29th edition. It says a second or early third century fragment of Mark. This was the famous first century Mark that turned out not to be first century. This is the one that Dan Wallace famously said in a debate with Bart Ehrman. Well, we have this papyri fragment that's from the first century that proves that Mark is very early, and it turned out that claim that he passed along was debunked. But again, our purposes here is not only to question whether it's from the second century, but also it's very fragmentary. It's only a little sliver of the text of Mark. And then there are two unsealed manuscripts that he lists here that are also dated to the second century in addition to the papyri. One of those is this manuscript 0189. He says a parchment fragment of Acts dated by NA 28 to second or third century, but has been given a wide range of other dates. And I'm going to look that one up real quickly. After it lists the papyri, it lists the unseals that have a leading 0, and 0189 is found in Berlin, and it includes Acts 5, verses 3 through 21. It's a very small part of the book of Acts. And then the 12th and last example of these possibly second century New Testament extant remains is 0171. He says a parchment manuscript containing portions of Matthew and Luke. While originally dated to the 4th century, more recent work has suggested 2nd century is a possibility. And so 0171, in the Nestle Aland 28th edition, it says around the year 300. Looks like it's in Florence, Italy, and it has Matthew 10, verses 17 through 23, and Matthew 10, verses 25 through 32, and then Luke chapter 22, verses 44 through 56, and verses 61 through 64 in Luke 22. So just a few slivers of Matthew and Luke. So let's continue and go on to see what Kruger's conclusions are. It's a really short blog post. He says, of course, these are just possible second century manuscripts. A number of these may prove to be third or even fourth century. The dating of manuscripts is not an exact science. It's a great point he's making there. These many times are hypotheses, and there's not exactitude in dating these manuscripts. There is an inevitable level of imprecision that must be acknowledged. And again, I think this is a barrier for modern reconstruction textual criticism. There's going to be inexactitude. There's going to be imprecision. This is why 21st century men who have embraced modern textual criticism, including evangelicals and even Reformed, cannot say we can reconstruct the text of the Bible. We are only working towards some approximation of it. His final paragraph here. While 12 New Testament manuscripts may not seem like a lot, especially when compared to the totality of known New Testament manuscripts, they still provide remarkably early access to some of the New Testament text. And these snippets of the text in the second century do not reveal a text that is notably different than what we find in the later manuscript tradition. Now, again, he is doing, trying to buttress a defense of the use of reconstruction textual criticism. And he says, well, we don't have a lot of evidence, but we do have these 12 manuscripts, and they do provide us some early access to some of the New Testament texts. And these little snippets that we can find are consistent with essentially with the text that we've reconstructed by and large. That seems to be his argument. But is that really the case? I mean, for one thing, these manuscripts, as we've seen, are by and large fragments from the Gospels. Very little from the Pauline writings, Catholic epistles, or the Book of Revelation. They're mainly fragments from the Gospels, and it's it's very fragmentary. These aren't whole books that are from the second century. And so we only have very fragmentary evidence that comes from the second century. We only have very fragmentary early evidence. And he says, well, it's consistent with what we find in later manuscripts. Well, is that really the case? Let's think, for example, about the ending of the Gospel of Mark. There are no second century witnesses to the ending of Mark. And why is it then that modern scholars will say clearly Mark originally ended at Mark 16:8? On what basis did they make such an assumption? In fact, the majority of extant manuscripts include Mark 16:9 through 20. Only two manuscripts, unsealed manuscripts, early unsealed manuscripts, omit Mark 16:9 through 20. So does the early papyri evidence really doesn't say anything about the ending of Mark? And think about the Coma Joanneum, 1 John 5:7. There is no papyri evidence for or against the authenticity of 1 John 5:7. There's very little early evidence for any of the so-called Catholic or general epistles. Most of the things we have in Greek are late. And again, this gap is why in 21st century modern textual criticism, most of the mainline academic scholars are saying we cannot take this evidence, and based on this empirical evidence, we can't claim to have reconstructed the original autograph. And of course, those of us who are proponents for the retrieval of classic Protestant bibliology would say that that's not a defeater for our position, because we would say the Bible has been preserved for us by God. It has been preserved in God's special providence. And so we're not relying on human reasoning to study the extant remains of the empirical evidence to approximate a text. We believe that God was at work in history, and we have a text that is authentic, that God preserved, and that the people of God, when they read the scriptures, heard in the scriptures that were preserved the voice of their shepherd. And so, again, I think this article, far from buttressing our confidence in the reconstruction method, really exposes the weaknesses of it. We really don't have an abundance of riches when it comes to the extant early evidence from New Testament manuscripts. And that's okay from our perspective because we're not dependent upon empirical reconstruction. We have the text that was preserved. We have that in the faithful copies that were acknowledged at the time of the Protestant Reformation, when there was the technological revolution of the printing press. And that's the text that became the basis for all the classic Protestant translations in various languages. And that is the text that has been read, preached, taught, exposited in the Protestant age, even up to our present moment. Well, with that, I'm going to bring this episode to a conclusion. I hope that this has been a helpful and edifying discussion that we've had today. I do appreciate Dr. Kruger, a lot of his work. Again, I couldn't remember the name of the book in the last podcast, but it's I think it's called Canon Revisited. And I've used that book as a textbook in some classes that I've taught. Appreciate a lot of things, a lot of the research, a lot of his knowledge about things. Again, I would, humbly say I have some disagreements. And if we're going to defend the canonical books, I think we also have to defend the canonical texts of those books. But anyways, I think in this case, I think this discussion of these 12 extant witnesses that are possibly from the second century, again, reveal an Achilles heel of the reconstruction method. And that's why we can't ever rely on it if we want to ever hope to have a confidence in what the Bible is, lest we give an uncertain sound. We must know what the Bible is, especially because we're Protestants and we stand on the Reformation principle of sola scriptura. Well, with that, again, I'll bring this to an end, and I'll look forward to speaking to you in the next episode. Till then, take care, and may the Lord richly bless you.